Can a state tell the federal government where its agents can and can't go? Because people have been asking that since New Mexico became the first state in the union to pass a new law regarding elections. Now, that new law basically restricts federal troops and armed federal personnel from being stationed at polling places.
I believe that it's in the best interest of New Mexico to not let any politician in the White House tell us that we're not going to fully participate, free from any harassment or interventions. We are sending a message to everyone. We will hold free and fair elections, and New Mexicans will be safe and in every ballot location, and that's our responsibility. The Constitution says states run their elections, and that bill makes that painfully re-clear to the federal government.
Supporters say it's about protecting voters from intimidation. Critics say that it could run into the Constitution. So what exactly did New Mexico pass? And can the state actually enforce it? First, let's clear up what the law does and doesn't do. The bill, known as Senate Bill 264, creates a new section of the New Mexico Election Code dealing with election interference. And one of the most talked about sections of this provision is Section 3, that says that a person cannot order, bring, or keep troops or armed personnel that serve in the United States at a polling place or within 50 feet of a monitored ballot drop box from 28 days before an election through Election Day. That law does include one major exception, though, and that is if those forces are necessary to repel armed enemies of the United States, such as terrorists. The bill continues on to inform that it prohibits interference with elected officials, poll workers, voters, challengers, and election observers. Violations and breakers of the law can be charged with a fourth-degree felony. Big trouble. That military and federal personnel provision is what grabbed national attention. Supporters of the law say that the goal is simple: to protect voters. And New Mexico's Secretary of State Maggie Toulouse Oliver agrees with that. She also argues that the armed federal personnel don't have a role in administrating elections and that their presence could intimidate voters. Supporters also point to historical examples where armed government presence around elections was used to discourage or influence voters, as in the Jim Crow era. From the supporters' perspective, elections should be conducted by state and local officials, not federal troops or armed federal agents. The law is part of a broader effort to prevent intimidation, disruption, and interference at polling places. But here's where it can get complicated. Even some people who do support the goals of the law have raised questions about whether New Mexico can actually enforce this provision against federal personnel. The issue comes down to something called the Supremacy Clause, which is in the U.S. Constitution. And the Supremacy Clause basically says that the federal law is the supreme law of the land. So when federal and state law have conflict, the federal law usually wins. So critics and legal observers are asking, well, what happens if a federal officer is acting under lawful federal authority? Can the state prosecute that officer? Can New Mexico impose state criminal penalties on someone carrying out a federal mission? Well, obviously, those aren't easy questions, and the answers may ultimately depend on how courts interpret the law, if it is ever challenged. At this point, there's no major court ruling answering these questions. The law is on the books, but its limits may not be fully understood until it's tested in a real-world situation. That means the biggest question isn't necessarily what the law says. The biggest question is what happens if New Mexico and the federal government disagree about who has authority at a polling place. Would the state attempt to enforce the law? And would federal officials challenge it? Would a court step in? Right now, these questions remain unanswered. So, Can New Mexico really ban federal agents from polling places? The state has passed a law saying certain federal troops and armed personnel cannot be stationed there. But whether that law can be enforced against federal personnel acting under federal authority, oh, well, that's a separate constitutional question, and one that may ultimately have to be settled in court. For now, the law exists, the debates continue, and the answer may not be clear until it is challenged.